Marcus stood at the edge of the training ground, his worn leather boots scuffing against the dusty earth as he watched the other recruits practice their formations. At 17, he was among the youngest candidates attempting to join the Royal Guard, but his slight frame and nervous demeanor made him appear even more out of place among the seasoned warriors and ambitious nobles' sons. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the Royal Military Academy, where dozens of hopefuls had gathered for the most prestigious recruitment process in the kingdom. Some came from military families with generations of service, others were sons of wealthy merchants seeking honor and status. Then there was Marcus, the blacksmith's apprentice from the outer districts, who had somehow managed to scrape together enough coins to pay the application fee. Captain Aldrich Thornfield, a man whose scarred face told stories of countless battles, stood before the assembled candidates. His voice boomed across the courtyard as he explained the week-long selection process that would determine who among them was worthy of protecting the royal family. The trials would test not only their physical prowess, but also their mental fortitude, strategic thinking, and unwavering loyalty to the crown. "Look at that one," whispered Jonathan Blackwood, the eldest son of a prominent duke, nodding toward Marcus. "Did they start accepting charity cases?" His comment drew snickers from the group of noble-born recruits who had clustered together, their expensive armor gleaming in the sunlight. Marcus pretended not to hear, but his cheeks burned with embarrassment. He had known this would happen. His simple cloth tunic and basic leather armor stood in stark contrast to the ornate gear worn by his competitors. While they carried swords forged by master craftsmen, Marcus held a blade that his father had made in their modest workshop, functional, but far from beautiful. The first trial was a test of basic combat skills. Each recruit was paired with another for a sparring match using wooden practice swords. The nobles dominated these early rounds, their years of private tutoring evident in their polished techniques and confident stances. When Marcus's turn came, he was matched against Roderick Ashford, a mountain of a young man whose family had served in the Royal Guard for 3 generations. The circle of watching recruits grew quiet as the mismatched pair faced each other. Roderick stood nearly a foot taller than Marcus, his broad shoulders and muscled arms making him look more like a fully grown knight than a teenage recruit. He hefted his practice sword with casual ease, while Marcus struggled to keep his weapon steady in his trembling hands. "This should be over quickly," someone muttered from the crowd. Captain Thornfield raised his hand, and the match began. Roderick immediately pressed forward with aggressive strikes, forcing Marcus to scramble backward. The smaller boy managed to block the first few attacks, but his defensive stance was awkward and uncertain. The wooden swords clacked together repeatedly as Marcus gave ground, his breathing becoming labored, while Roderick seemed to be barely exerting himself. The watching crowd began to murmur their predictions of Marcus's swift defeat. Some even started placing small wagers on how long the village boy would last against the nobleman's son. Their whispered conversations grew louder as Marcus stumbled, nearly losing his footing while avoiding a particularly vicious overhead strike. "He doesn't belong here," declared Lucian Silverdale, another duke's son whose perfectly groomed appearance suggested he had never known a day of real hardship. "The Royal Guard is meant for those of breeding and proper training, not some commoner who probably learned swordplay from hay bales." The laughter that followed this comment was cruel and deliberate, designed to demoralize Marcus further. Even some of the instructors seemed to share skeptical glances, wondering how this obviously outmatched boy had managed to gain entry to their elite institution. Marcus felt his confidence crumbling with each mocking laugh and dismissive comment. His sword work became even more erratic as he tried desperately to prove himself worthy, but his frantic efforts only made him appear more amateurish. Roderick, sensing his opponent's growing panic, increased his assault, driving Marcus toward the edge of the sparring circle. The jeers grew louder as Marcus's back foot crossed the boundary line, ending the match in his defeat. He stood there breathing heavily, sweat dripping from his brow, while Roderick barely looked winded. The noble-born recruit offered a condescending pat on Marcus's shoulder before walking away to accept congratulations from his peers. "Perhaps you should consider a career more suited to your station," suggested Jonathan Blackwood with false sympathy. "I hear the royal kitchens are always in need of pot scrubbers." The group of nobles erupted in fresh laughter at this suggestion, their amusement echoing across the courtyard. Marcus felt his face burn with humiliation as he realized that nearly everyone present viewed him as nothing more than entertainment, an amusing diversion before the real competition began among the serious candidates. Even the common-born recruits, those few who came from merchant families or minor landholders, seemed eager to distance themselves from Marcus's embarrassing display. They whispered among themselves, clearly worried that association with such an obvious failure might damage their own chances of advancement. Captain Thornfield called for the next pair of sparring partners, and the attention of the crowd gradually shifted away from Marcus's defeat. He stood alone at the edge of the circle, clutching his practice sword and fighting back tears of frustration and shame. This was only the first trial, and already he felt completely outclassed and unwelcome. The remainder of the day brought no improvement in his situation. During the strength trials, Marcus struggled to complete the required number of sword strikes against weighted practice dummies, his arms burning with exhaustion, while others finished the exercise with ease. The endurance run around the academy grounds left him trailing far behind the pack, his lungs screaming for air as the fittest recruits lapped him on the track. By evening, when the recruits gathered in the great hall for their first meal together, Marcus found himself sitting alone at the end of a long wooden table. The conversations around him buzzed with excitement as the stronger candidates discussed their performances and speculated about tomorrow's challenges. No one invited him to join their discussions or even acknowledged his presence. The food was better than anything Marcus had eaten at home, but he could barely taste it as he mechanically chewed through his portion of roasted meat and vegetables. His mind kept replaying the day's failures, each mistake magnified by the memory of his peers' laughter and dismissive comments. "Don't look so glum," said a voice from across the table. Marcus looked up to see Thomas Hartwell, one of the few recruits who hadn't openly mocked him. Thomas came from a family of career soldiers, not nobility, but his natural talent and disciplined training had already marked him as a likely candidate for selection. "Tomorrow will be different," Thomas continued, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe his own words. "The archery trials might suit you better than sword play." Marcus nodded gratefully at this small gesture of kindness, but privately he doubted that archery would prove to be his salvation. He had some experience with a bow from hunting small game in the woods near his village, but nothing that would prepare him for the precision and skill expected of Royal Guard candidates. As the evening wore on and the other recruits retired to their shared barracks rooms, Marcus lay awake on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling and listening to the quiet conversations and occasional laughter from the beds around him. Tomorrow would bring new trials and fresh opportunities for humiliation. He wondered if he should simply pack his few belongings and return home before suffering further embarrassment. But something deep inside him, a stubborn flame that had driven him to apply for the Royal Guard in the first place, refused to be extinguished by a single day of failure. His father had always told him that true strength came not from never falling down, but from getting back up no matter how many times you were knocked down. Marcus clenched his fists under his thin blanket and made a silent promise to himself that he would not give his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him quit. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, matching Marcus's mood as he joined the other recruits for the second day of trials. The archery range had been set up in a large field behind the main academy buildings, with targets placed at varying distances and heights to test different aspects of marksmanship skill. Captain Thornfield explained the scoring system as the recruits examined the bows and arrows provided for the trial. Points would be awarded based on accuracy and consistency across multiple rounds of shooting, with bonus points available for hitting the smallest target rings at the greatest distances. Marcus selected a bow that felt comfortable in his hands, testing its draw weight and flexibility. Around him, the other candidates were doing the same, some clearly more familiar with archery than others. The noble-born recruits generally showed confidence with their weapons, many having learned archery as part of their privileged educations. "Watch this," announced Lucian Silverdale as he stepped up to the shooting line. "My archery instructor was trained by the old masters of the Eastern Kingdoms." He drew his bow with practiced ease and released an arrow that struck close to the center of a target 50 yards away. The watching recruits murmured appreciatively, and several offered congratulations on the impressive shot. One by one, the candidates took their turns at the shooting line, with varying degrees of success. Some proved to be natural marksmen, consistently hitting their intended targets with arrows grouped tightly together. Others struggled with the fundamentals of stance and aim, their arrows scattered across the target faces or missing entirely. When Marcus's turn arrived, the murmuring and casual conversations among the watching recruits continued, most paying little attention to what they expected would be another disappointing performance from the village blacksmith's son. He approached the shooting line with his selected bow, trying to block out the dismissive chatter behind him and focus on the distant target. Marcus drew the bowstring back slowly, feeling the familiar tension build in his shoulders and back muscles. The weight and balance of this bow differed slightly from the simple hunting bow he used at home, but the basic mechanics remained the same. He had spent countless hours in the forests around his village, tracking rabbits and deer with his father, learning patience and precision out of necessity rather than sport. The target 50 yards away seemed impossibly small as Marcus sighted down the arrow shaft. Behind him, he could hear Jonathan Blackwood making another cutting remark about how some people never learned when they were outclassed. The laughter that followed nearly broke his concentration, but Marcus forced himself to breathe deeply and focus only on the distant bullseye. He released the arrow with a smooth, fluid motion that surprised even himself. The projectile sailed through the morning air in a perfect arc, its fletched tail stabilizing the flight as it covered the distance to the target. There was a satisfying thunk as the arrow struck home, embedding itself firmly in the red center ring of the target. The laughter behind Marcus died away abruptly, replaced by a moment of stunned silence. Even Captain Thornfield raised an eyebrow at the unexpected accuracy of the shot, though he made no comment and simply marked something on his evaluation sheet. "Lucky shot," muttered Roderick Ashford, though his voice lacked its previous confidence. "Anyone can get lucky once." Marcus said nothing, simply nocked another arrow and prepared for his second attempt. This time, he felt more confident in his grip and stance, the bow seeming to become an extension of his arms rather than a foreign tool. The second arrow followed almost the exact same path as the first, striking the target barely an inch away from his initial shot. Now the watching recruits were paying closer attention, their casual conversations replaced by focused observation of Marcus's technique. His third arrow split the difference between the first two, creating a tight grouping that would have been respectable for any of the candidates. The fourth and fifth shots expanded the group only slightly, all 5 arrows clustered within the highest scoring region of the target. "Impressive shooting, recruit," acknowledged Captain Thornfield, making additional notes on his evaluation. "Let's see how you handle the longer distances." The targets at 75 and 100 yards presented greater challenges, with wind and the natural drop of arrows over distance becoming significant factors. Marcus watched as several of the earlier shooters struggled with these longer shots, their arrows falling short or drifting wide of their intended marks. When his turn came at the 75-yard line, Marcus took extra time to observe the gentle breeze that was stirring the grass and leaves around the archery range. His father had taught him to read these natural signs during their hunting expeditions, understanding how air currents could deflect an arrow from its intended path. He adjusted his aim slightly to compensate for the crosswind and released his first shot at the distant target. The arrow struck the outer rings of the scoring area. Not a bullseye, but still a respectable hit at the increased distance. His subsequent shots improved as he fine-tuned his calculations, with his final arrow at 75 yards hitting very close to the center of the target. The 100-yard shots proved more challenging, but Marcus continued to demonstrate consistent accuracy that surprised everyone present, including himself. While he didn't achieve the perfect bullseyes of his earlier shorter-distance shooting, his arrows consistently found the target and scored respectable points. By the time the morning archery trials concluded, Marcus had posted one of the highest scores among all the recruits. The noble-born candidates who had dominated the previous day's sword trials found themselves looking at the rankings with expressions of disbelief and growing concern. "This changes nothing," declared Lucian Silverdale during the midday meal break. "Archery is just one skill among many. The Royal Guard needs well-rounded warriors, not specialists who can only perform one task adequately." But Marcus could sense a shift in the atmosphere around him. The other recruits were no longer quite as quick to dismiss him or make jokes at his expense. Several even nodded respectfully when he passed by their groups, though none went so far as to actually invite him to join their conversations. The afternoon brought mounted combat trials, an area where Marcus expected to struggle significantly. His family had owned only a single aging draft horse, used primarily for heavy work around the smithy. His experience with riding was limited to occasional trips to the market in the next village, hardly preparation for the complex maneuvers required of Royal Guard cavalry. Captain Thornfield introduced the mounted combat instructor, Sir Gareth Ironhold, a grizzled veteran whose reputation as a horseman was legendary throughout the kingdom. Sir Gareth explained that the trial would test their ability to control their mounts while engaging in simulated combat, including target shooting from horseback and maneuvering through obstacle courses designed to mimic battlefield conditions. The horses provided for the trial were well-trained military mounts, far superior to anything Marcus had ever ridden. As he approached his assigned horse, a spirited chestnut mare named Wind Chaser, he felt his earlier confidence beginning to evaporate. The animal was clearly bred for speed and agility, her intelligent eyes seeming to assess his experience level as he attempted to mount. Marcus managed to get into the saddle without embarrassing himself, though his seat was obviously less secure than those of recruits who had grown up riding. When Sir Gareth called for the first exercise, a simple walk-trot-canter sequence around the practice field, Marcus's limitations became apparent to everyone watching. His riding posture was awkward and uncertain, his hands too tight on the reins as he tried to maintain control of his mount. Wind Chaser seemed to sense his inexperience and tested his authority with small acts of rebellion, turning her head to crop grass or slowing her pace despite his urging. The noble recruits, most of whom had been riding since childhood, demonstrated effortless control of their horses. They moved through the gates with fluid grace, their seats deep and secure as their mounts responded immediately to subtle commands. The contrast between their polished horsemanship and Marcus's amateur struggles was painfully obvious. "Perhaps our village champion should have spent less time shooting arrows and more time learning to ride properly," suggested Jonathan Blackwood, as Marcus struggled to convince Wind Chaser to maintain a steady canter. The comment drew appreciative chuckles from several other recruits who had regained their confidence after the morning's archery surprises. The mounted archery portion of the trial proved even more challenging for Marcus. Shooting accurately from horseback required a completely different set of skills than ground-based archery, demanding split-second timing and the ability to maintain proper form while dealing with the motion of a moving horse. Marcus's first attempts were disasters, his arrows sailing wide of their targets as he struggled to coordinate his shooting with Windchaser's gait. The combination of his uncertain riding position and the unfamiliar timing required for mounted archery resulted in embarrassingly poor scores that had the watching recruits shaking their heads in renewed dismissal. "There's the village boy we all expected to see," commented Roderick Ashford with satisfaction. "I was beginning to wonder if he had somehow managed to cheat during the ground archery trials." The obstacle course proved equally humiliating for Marcus. While the experienced riders guided their horses smoothly through the series of jumps, tight turns, and narrow passages, Marcus and Windchaser struggled with even the basic elements. The mare seemed to grow increasingly frustrated with his inexpert guidance, occasionally refusing obstacles entirely or taking them at awkward angles that nearly unseated him. By the end of the mounted combat trials, Marcus had posted scores that placed him near the bottom of the rankings, completely erasing the advantage he had gained from his archery performance. The other recruits had regained their dismissive attitudes, apparently viewing his morning success as an aberration rather than a sign of genuine capability. During the evening meal, Marcus once again found himself eating alone while conversations swirled around him about the day's events. The noble recruits were particularly animated in their discussions, confident that the natural order had been restored and that the selection process would ultimately favor those of proper breeding and training. Thomas Hartwell stopped by Marcus's table briefly, offering a few words of encouragement about the following day's trials. "Tomorrow we have strategy and tactics sessions," he mentioned. "Academic work rather than physical trials. That might be more to your strengths." Marcus appreciated the gesture, though he harbored private doubts about his prospects in military strategy sessions. His education had been limited to basic reading and arithmetic, hardly preparation for complex tactical analysis and battlefield planning. The noble recruits had undoubtedly received extensive tutoring in military history and strategic thinking as part of their privileged educations. That night, as Marcus lay on his cot listening to the confident conversations of his fellow recruits, he reflected on the wild swings of fortune he had experienced during his second day at the academy. The morning's archery success had given him a tantalizing glimpse of what it might feel like to belong among these elite candidates. But the afternoon's failures had quickly reminded him of his humble origins and limited preparation. He thought about his father, who was probably working late in the smithy at this very moment, wondering how his son was faring in his unlikely quest to join the Royal Guard. Marcus had promised to make his family proud, but after 2 days of trials, he was beginning to understand just how difficult that promise would be to keep. The third day dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for the outdoor tactical exercises that Sir Gareth had planned. The recruits assembled in the main courtyard, where detailed maps and scenario briefings had been laid out on large wooden tables. Captain Thornfield explained that they would be divided into small teams and given complex military problems to solve, testing their ability to think strategically under pressure. Marcus found himself assigned to a team with 3 other recruits, including Lucian Silverdale and 2 sons of minor nobles whose names he had not yet learned. The assignment felt deliberately designed to put him at a disadvantage, surrounded by young men who had been studying military strategy since childhood and who clearly viewed him as a liability to their team's chances of success. Their first scenario involved planning the defense of a mountain pass against a numerically superior enemy force. The team had 1 hour to develop a comprehensive strategy using the terrain features, available troops, and logistical constraints outlined in their briefing materials. Marcus listened quietly as his teammates immediately launched into animated discussion of classical military tactics and historical precedents. Their conversation was filled with references to famous battles and strategic principles that were completely foreign to him, making him feel more out of place than ever. Obviously, we need to establish overlapping fields of fire from elevated positions, declared Lucian, sketching defensive positions on the map. The enemy will be forced to advance through this narrow defile, giving us significant advantages if we position our archers correctly. The other team members nodded enthusiastically and began adding their own suggestions for troop deployments and supply line management. Marcus studied the map carefully, noting details that his teammates seemed to be overlooking in their eagerness to demonstrate their theoretical knowledge. Finally, when there was a brief pause in their discussion, Marcus tentatively raised his hand. "What about the water supply?" he asked quietly. The three noble recruits turned to stare at him with expressions of surprise and mild irritation. "What about it?" Lucian responded curtly. Marcus pointed to a small stream marked on the map, flowing down from the mountains behind their defensive positions. "The stream comes from high ground that the enemy might be able to reach by going around through these side valleys. If they poison the water or divert it somehow, our defenders won't last long without fresh water." His teammates exchanged glances, clearly annoyed that the village blacksmith's son had identified something they had missed. But as they studied the map more carefully, they were forced to acknowledge that Marcus had raised a valid concern that could significantly impact their defensive strategy. "Fine," muttered one of the minor nobles. "We'll need to post guards at the water source and establish alternative supply lines. Anything else, village boy?" Marcus continued studying the map, his practical mind identifying several other potential problems that his more academically trained teammates had overlooked. While they focused on grand strategic concepts and textbook tactics, he noticed logistical challenges and terrain features that could make or break their defensive plan. As the week progressed, a pattern began to emerge that confused and frustrated the noble-born recruits. While Marcus continued to struggle with the more traditional military skills like swordplay and horsemanship, he consistently demonstrated an uncanny ability to notice details that others missed and solve practical problems that stumped his theoretically trained peers. During a complex siege warfare exercise, Marcus quietly suggested that the attacking force could exploit a weakness in the castle's design that involved the kitchen waste disposal system. His teammates initially scoffed at this unglamorous observation, but when the instructors reviewed their plans, they praised the team for identifying what they called an often overlooked vulnerability in medieval fortification design. In another scenario involving the protection of a royal convoy through hostile territory, Marcus pointed out that the proposed route would take them past several abandoned quarries where ambushes could be staged with devastating effect. Again, his practical eye for terrain and potential dangers proved invaluable, though his teammates were reluctant to acknowledge his contributions. The other recruits began to notice these patterns, though their reactions varied widely. Some, like Thomas Hartwell, started to view Marcus with genuine respect and sought his opinions during group discussions. Others, particularly among the noble-born candidates, became increasingly resentful of what they saw as lucky guesses and peasant cunning that had no place in sophisticated military planning. "He's just a common laborer who notices things that don't matter to real warriors," complained Jonathan Blackwood during one evening meal. "Strategy and tactics are about leadership and grand thinking, not worrying about water supplies and waste systems like some kind of servant." But Captain Thornfield and the other instructors seemed to appreciate Marcus's practical insights more with each passing day. During one particularly complex exercise involving the coordination of multiple military units, the captain stopped by Marcus's team specifically to ask for his assessment of their plan's feasibility. "Recruit Marcus," Captain Thornfield said formally. "You've been unusually quiet during this planning session. Do you see any potential issues with the supply line management that your team has proposed?" Marcus studied the elaborate plan his teammates had developed, which involved coordinating infantry, cavalry, and siege equipment across a campaign lasting several weeks. The strategy was theoretically sound and demonstrated impressive knowledge of military doctrine, but Marcus could see several practical flaws that could doom the entire operation. "Sir," Marcus began hesitantly, "the plan calls for the cavalry units to be resupplied with fresh horses every 10 days. But I don't see how that's possible given the distances involved and the terrain they'd have to cross. Also, the siege equipment would need to be transported across 3 different river crossings, and there's no provision for what happens if those bridges are destroyed or the rivers flood during the spring melt season." His teammates glared at him with barely concealed anger. They had spent hours crafting what they believed was a brilliant strategic plan, only to have the village blacksmith's son point out fundamental flaws that threatened to unravel their entire concept. Captain Thornfield nodded thoughtfully and made several notes on his evaluation sheet. "Excellent observations, recruit. These are exactly the kind of practical considerations that separate theoretical planning from executable strategy. Your team will need to address these issues before presenting your final proposal." The captain moved on to evaluate other teams, leaving Marcus's teammates to rebuild their strategy around his inconvenient but undeniable insights. The atmosphere within the group had grown decidedly chilly, with Lucian and the others treating Marcus as a necessary nuisance rather than a valued team member. This pattern of grudging acknowledgement mixed with social rejection continued through the remainder of the strategic planning exercises. Marcus consistently identified practical problems and offered workable solutions, but his contributions were accepted with bad grace and minimal credit. The situation reached a breaking point during the final major exercise of the week, a comprehensive war game that would pit half the recruits against the other half in a large-scale simulation covering several square miles of countryside around the academy. The scenario involved a defending force trying to protect a critical river crossing while an attacking force attempted to capture it within a limited time frame. Marcus found himself assigned to the attacking team, along with most of the noble recruits who had made his life difficult throughout the week. Their commanding officer for the exercise was Jonathan Blackwood, whose family connections and confident demeanor had impressed the instructors enough to earn him the leadership position. The attacking team gathered in a large tent on the morning of the exercise to receive their briefing and develop their assault strategy. Jonathan stood before a detailed map of the area, outlining an ambitious plan that involved multiple simultaneous attacks designed to overwhelm the defenders through sheer coordination and aggressive tactics. "We'll hit them from 3 directions simultaneously," Jonathan explained with evident enthusiasm. "The main assault will go straight at the bridge, while flanking forces circle around to attack from the east and west. They won't be able to coordinate their defense effectively against such a complex attack." The plan sounded impressive and demonstrated Jonathan's thorough knowledge of military doctrine, but Marcus could see several problems that hadn't been addressed. He raised his hand tentatively, knowing that his input would not be welcomed, but feeling obligated to point out potentially fatal flaws. "What about the timing?" Marcus asked quietly. "The flanking forces have to travel much farther than the main assault group, and they'll be moving through rough terrain that could slow them down significantly. If they arrive too late, the defenders will be able to concentrate their entire force against each attack separately instead of having to split their attention." Jonathan's face flushed with irritation at having his plan questioned by someone he viewed as fundamentally inferior. "The timing has been calculated precisely based on standard movement rates for military units," he replied curtly. "Perhaps you should focus on following orders rather than trying to think above your station." Several other recruits chuckled at this put-down, enjoying the spectacle of the village boy being reminded of his place. Marcus fell silent, but he continued to study the map and notice other potential problems that Jonathan's plan had failed to address. The war game began at dawn, with both teams moving to their starting positions in the early morning mist. Marcus found himself assigned to one of the flanking forces, a group of 8 recruits led by Roderick Ashford, whose mission was to circle around through the eastern hills and attack the defenders from an unexpected direction. As they began their movement through the rough terrain, Marcus's concerns about timing quickly proved justified. The route that had looked straightforward on the map turned out to be far more challenging in reality, with steep slopes, dense undergrowth, and rocky ground that slowed their progress to a crawl. Roderick pushed the group to maintain their planned pace, but it quickly became clear that they were falling behind schedule. What should have been a 2-hour approach march was stretching toward 3 hours, and they hadn't even reached the halfway point of their route. "We need to find a faster way," muttered one of the recruits as he struggled through a particularly dense thicket. "At this rate, the main assault will be over before we even get into position." Marcus had been studying the terrain as they moved, comparing the actual landscape to his memory of the map they had studied during the planning session. He thought he could see a better route that would save significant time, but he hesitated to suggest it given his teammates' attitudes toward his input. Finally, as they struggled up a particularly steep slope that was costing them precious minutes, Marcus decided to speak up despite the likely reception his suggestion would receive. "There's an old hunting trail that runs along the ridgeline," he said quietly to Roderick. "It's not marked on the military maps, but I noticed it yesterday during our reconnaissance. If we can find the entrance, it should cut at least an hour off our travel time." Roderick stopped and turned to face Marcus with an expression of skepticism and annoyance. "How could you possibly know about trails that aren't on the official maps?" he demanded. Marcus felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment as the entire group stopped to stare at him. I spent some time exploring the area after the evening meals," he admitted. "My father taught me to always scout unfamiliar territory when I have the chance." The other recruits exchanged glances that mixed amusement with contempt. The idea that the village blacksmith's son had been wandering around the countryside like some kind of scout seemed both presumptuous and slightly pathetic to young men who had been trained to rely on official information and established procedures. "This isn't a hunting expedition," Roderick replied with cutting dismissal. "We follow the planned route and maintain proper military discipline. I'm not going to risk the success of our mission based on the wanderings of someone who probably got lost looking for the latrine." The group resumed their difficult climb up the official route, while Marcus followed silently behind, burning with frustration at their refusal to consider his suggestion. He could see the entrance to the hunting trail he had mentioned, barely visible through the trees but clearly leading toward their destination by a much easier path. As the morning wore on and their delay continued to mount, the atmosphere within the flanking force grew increasingly tense. Radio communications with the main assault group confirmed that the attack on the bridge was proceeding on schedule, but without support from the flanking forces, the defenders were able to concentrate their entire strength against Jonathan's frontal assault. By the time Roderick's group finally reached their intended attack position, they were nearly 2 hours behind schedule. The main assault had already been repelled with heavy simulated casualties, and the defending force had repositioned to meet the belated flanking attacks with overwhelming strength. The exercise ended in complete failure for the attacking team, with Jonathan's ambitious strategy falling apart due to the timing problems that Marcus had identified but been forbidden to address. During the post-exercise debrief, the instructors were highly critical of the attacking team's planning and execution, particularly their failure to account for practical challenges that should have been obvious during the planning phase. Captain Thornfield stood before the assembled recruits, his expression stern as he reviewed the mistakes that had doomed the attacking force. "Leadership requires more than knowledge of textbook tactics," he declared. "A commander must be willing to listen to input from subordinates who may have valuable insights, even if those insights come from unexpected sources." His eyes seemed to linger on Jonathan and Roderick as he continued. Pride and assumptions about social hierarchy have no place on the battlefield. A wise leader recognizes that practical experience and careful observation can be more valuable than theoretical knowledge, regardless of the source. The noble recruits shifted uncomfortably under this criticism, clearly understanding that their dismissive treatment of Marcus's suggestions had contributed significantly to their defeat. But rather than accepting responsibility for their failures, many seemed to blame Marcus for not being more forceful in presenting his concerns. If he had information that could have helped, he should have spoken up more clearly, muttered Lucian during the evening meal. It's not our fault that he lacks the confidence to present his ideas properly. This attempt to shift blame onto Marcus for their own refusal to listen struck Thomas Hartwell as particularly unfair. He had watched the dynamics within the attacking team throughout the week and seen how consistently Marcus's practical insights had been dismissed or grudgingly accepted without acknowledgement. Maybe the problem isn't his confidence, Thomas suggested quietly. Maybe the problem is that some people are so sure of their own superiority that they can't recognize good ideas when they hear them. The table fell silent at this challenge to the established social order among the recruits. The noble-born candidates were unaccustomed to having their attitudes questioned by anyone, particularly someone of Thomas's relatively modest background. But other recruits had also noticed the patterns of the past week, and some were beginning to question their initial assumptions about Marcus's capabilities and worth as a potential royal guard. The war game failure had been too obvious and costly to ignore, and the instructor's pointed criticism of the leadership failures made it clear that dismissing practical input had real consequences. As the week of trials drew toward its close, the atmosphere among the recruits had shifted subtly but significantly. Marcus was no longer universally dismissed as a hopeless charity case, though he also hadn't gained full acceptance from his peers. Instead, he occupied an uncomfortable middle ground where his practical skills were grudgingly acknowledged while his social status remained firmly at the bottom of the hierarchy. The final day would bring the most challenging and decisive trial of all, one that would determine not only who possessed the technical skills to serve in the royal guard, but who had the character and judgment to protect the royal family in moments of genuine crisis. The final day of trials began with an announcement that sent ripples of excitement and anxiety through the assembled recruits. Captain Thornfield stood before them in full ceremonial armor, his bearing more formal than they had seen throughout the week of testing. "Today you will face your ultimate evaluation," he declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard with solemn authority. His Royal Majesty King Edmund will personally observe the final trial, along with Sir Marcus Ravencrest, Captain of the Royal Guard, and other members of the Royal Court. The recruits straightened involuntarily at this news. They had known that their performance was being evaluated for potential service to the crown, but the prospect of performing directly before the king himself transformed the stakes entirely. This was no longer just about passing a test or earning a prestigious position. It was about proving their worth in the eyes of the monarch they hoped to serve. Marcus felt his stomach clench with nervousness as he considered the implications. Throughout the week, he had gradually earned a measure of grudging respect from some of his fellow recruits and the instructors, but the thought of performing before royalty brought back all his insecurities about his humble origins and limited training. "The final trial will test your judgment, courage, and skill under extreme pressure," Captain Thornfield continued. "You will face scenarios designed to simulate the real dangers that members of the Royal Guard encounter in their duties. There will be no second chances, no opportunities to reconsider your actions. The decisions you make today will determine not only your own fate, but potentially the lives of those you are sworn to protect." As the morning progressed, elaborate preparations transformed the academy grounds into a series of interconnected scenarios that would challenge every aspect of the recruits' training. Mock buildings were erected to simulate palace corridors. Crowds of academy staff were positioned to represent court gatherings, and various props were distributed to create realistic crisis situations. The recruits were divided into small groups and rotated through different scenarios throughout the day, with their performance in each situation carefully evaluated by teams of instructors and veteran royal guards. The scenarios ranged from crowd control during public ceremonies to responding to assassination attempts and managing hostage situations. Marcus found himself assigned to the same evaluation group as several of the noble recruits who had made his week so difficult, including Jonathan Blackwood and Lucian Silverdale. The irony wasn't lost on him that his final chance to prove himself would come while surrounded by the same young men who had spent days dismissing his capabilities. Their first scenario involved protecting a simulated royal procession through a crowded marketplace where potential threats could emerge from any direction. The recruits were positioned at key points along the route and given specific responsibilities for monitoring different sections of the crowd. Marcus was assigned to an elevated position overlooking the main thoroughfare, armed with a crossbow and tasked with identifying and neutralizing any ranged threats that might emerge from the surrounding buildings. It was a responsibility that played to his demonstrated strengths in archery, but the pressure of performing before royal observers made his hands tremble slightly as he took his position. The simulated procession began with appropriate pomp and ceremony, complete with actors portraying the royal family and court officials. Marcus scanned the crowd methodically, looking for the subtle signs of trouble that his week of training had taught him to recognize. At first, everything proceeded smoothly. The crowd was enthusiastic but orderly, and the other recruits maintained their positions with professional discipline. Marcus began to relax slightly, thinking that perhaps this scenario would pass without incident. Then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. In a second-story window across the marketplace, barely visible in the shadows, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement that seemed wrong. While everyone else in the area was focused on the passing procession, someone in that window was moving with deliberate stealth, positioning what looked like a crossbow of their own. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to decide how to respond. The figure in the window was partially concealed and might be nothing more than a curious observer trying to get a better view of the proceedings. But the careful way they were positioning themselves, combined with the apparent weapon, suggested a much more sinister purpose. The protocol they had learned called for reporting suspicious activity through the chain of command, but there wasn't time for lengthy consultations. If this was indeed an assassination attempt, every second of delay could prove fatal to the simulated royal family below. Marcus made his decision with the kind of instant clarity that comes only in moments of genuine crisis. He raised his crossbow smoothly, sighted on the suspicious figure in the distant window, and released his shot in one fluid motion. The bolt flew across the marketplace with deadly accuracy, covering the distance to the second-story window in less than 2 seconds. It struck the concealed figure center mass, and immediately a red flag dropped from the window to signal that the threat had been successfully neutralized. The marketplace erupted in controlled chaos as the exercise controllers revealed that Marcus had indeed identified and eliminated a legitimate threat that none of the other recruits had noticed. The simulated royal procession was declared safe, and the scenario concluded with a successful protection of the royal family. But Marcus barely registered the congratulations and praise from the exercise controllers. His attention was focused on the expressions of shock and grudging amazement from his fellow recruits, particularly the noble-born candidates who had spent the week dismissing his capabilities. Jonathan Blackwood stared at Marcus with an expression of disbelief that bordered on accusation. "How did you even see that threat?" he demanded. "I was watching that same area and didn't notice anything suspicious." Captain Thornfield approached the group with King Edmund himself at his side, both men having witnessed Marcus's shot from their observation position. The king was a distinguished man in his 50s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing as they studied the young recruits. "That was exceptional marksmanship, young man," the king said directly to Marcus. "But more importantly, it demonstrated the kind of situational awareness and decisive judgment that we require in the Royal Guard. Can you explain how you identified the threat when others missed it?" Marcus felt his mouth go dry as he found himself speaking directly to the monarch he had only seen before in royal portraits. "Your Majesty," he began nervously, "I noticed that while everyone else in that area was watching the procession, the person in the window was moving differently. They were being very careful about staying hidden while positioning something that looked like a weapon. It seemed like the kind of behavior that would be suspicious in a real protection scenario." The king nodded thoughtfully, then turned to address the other recruits in the group. "And why do you think your fellow recruit noticed this threat, while the rest of you did not?" The noble recruits exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly struggling to provide an answer that wouldn't reflect poorly on their own performance. Finally, Lucian Silverdale ventured a response. "Perhaps he was just lucky, Your Majesty," Lucian suggested. "Sometimes random chance can make someone appear more skilled than they actually are." The king's expression hardened slightly at this response, and Marcus could sense that Lucian had made a significant error in judgment. King Edmund was clearly not someone who appreciated having obvious competence dismissed as mere luck, particularly when that dismissal came from someone who had failed to demonstrate equal competence himself. "I see," the king said coldly. "So you believe that consistently noticing important details that others miss is simply a matter of random chance? That identifying potential threats and providing practical solutions to complex problems requires no actual skill or judgment?" Lucian realized too late that he had walked into a trap of his own making. His face flushed red as he struggled to find a response that wouldn't make his position worse, but the damage was already done. King Edmund turned his attention back to Marcus, his expression warming considerably. "Tell me, young man, what is your background? How did you develop these observational skills that seem so natural to you?" Marcus swallowed nervously before responding. "I'm the son of a village blacksmith, Your Majesty. My father taught me to hunt in the forests around our home, and hunting requires learning to notice small details that most people would miss. You have to observe animal behavior, track movement patterns, understand how different creatures react to threats and opportunities. And you applied those same observational principles to this protection scenario," the king mused. "Interesting. It seems that practical experience in the real world can provide valuable training that formal military education sometimes overlooks." The king's words sent a clear message to everyone present about which approach he valued more highly. The noble recruits, who had dismissed Marcus's contributions throughout the week, were beginning to understand that their assumptions about social hierarchy and military competence were not shared by the monarch they hoped to serve. The remaining scenarios of the day continued to showcase Marcus's unique combination of practical skills and sound judgment. In a hostage situation simulation, he identified an unconventional but effective approach to neutralizing the threat without risking civilian casualties. During a crowd control exercise, he recognized early warning signs of potential riots that others missed and suggested preventive measures that diffused the situation before it escalated. By the time the final trial concluded in the late afternoon, it had become clear to everyone present that Marcus possessed exactly the kind of practical competence and reliable judgment that the Royal Guard required. His humble origins, which had been a source of mockery and dismissal from his peers, had actually provided him with real-world experience that proved invaluable in crisis situations. Captain Thornfield gathered all the recruits for the final evaluation and announcement of results. King Edmund remained present for this ceremony, emphasizing the importance of the selection process and the gravity of the responsibilities that came with Royal Guard service. Throughout this week of trials, Captain Thornfield began, we have evaluated each of you across multiple dimensions of competence and character. Some have excelled in traditional military skills, but struggled with practical judgment. Others have demonstrated theoretical knowledge, but failed to adapt to unexpected situations. A select few have shown the combination of skills, judgment, and character that we require. He paused to look directly at Marcus before continuing. The Royal Guard exists to protect not only the physical safety of the royal family, but also the stability and security of the realm itself. This requires individuals who can think independently, notice important details that others miss, and make sound decisions under extreme pressure. It requires people who value substance over appearance and effectiveness over social status. The captain announced the names of 6 recruits who had been selected for admission to the Royal Guard training program. Marcus's name was called first, followed by Thomas Hartwell and 4 others whose performance had impressed the evaluators throughout the week. Notably absent from the list were Jonathan Blackwood, Lucian Silverdale, and most of the other noble-born recruits who had dominated the early trials, but failed to demonstrate the practical competence and sound judgment required for actual Royal Guard service. The selected recruits were presented to King Edmund, who offered each a personal word of congratulation and encouragement. When he reached Marcus, the king's comments were particularly meaningful. "You have shown us that true merit comes not from birth or social position, but from character, skill, and dedication to duty," the king said. "I look forward to having you serve in the Royal Guard, where your unique perspective and practical experience will be valuable assets in protecting the crown." As the ceremony concluded and the recruits began to disperse, Marcus found himself surrounded by his fellow selectees, all offering congratulations and expressions of respect that would have been unimaginable just 1 week earlier. Even some of the recruits who had not been selected approached to acknowledge his achievement and apologize for their earlier dismissive attitudes. Thomas Hartwell clapped Marcus on the shoulder with genuine warmth. "I told you things would change," he said with a smile. "Though I have to admit, even I didn't expect you to impress the king himself quite so dramatically." The noble recruits who had spent the week mocking Marcus were notably absent from these congratulations. They had gathered in a separate group, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, anger, and wounded pride at having their assumptions about natural superiority so thoroughly refuted. As Marcus prepared to leave the academy and return home to share the incredible news with his family, he reflected on the lessons he had learned during this transformative week. The mockery and dismissal he had endured from his peers had been painful, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about the difference between appearance and reality, between social position and actual competence. More importantly, he had learned that true strength came not from never being challenged or criticized, but from persevering through adversity and proving one's worth through actions rather than words. The laughter of his detractors, which had once seemed so devastating, now felt like a distant memory compared to the satisfaction of earning genuine respect through demonstrated competence. The Royal Guard training program would present new challenges and opportunities, but Marcus now faced them with confidence, born from having already proven that humble origins were no barrier to extraordinary achievement. His deadly accuracy with a crossbow had certainly impressed the observers, but it was his broader demonstration of practical wisdom and sound judgment that had truly shocked those who had underestimated him. As he walked away from the academy toward his new future as a Royal Guard trainee, Marcus smiled to himself at the memory of their laughter. They had indeed laughed at him, right up until the moment when his skills and judgment proved superior to their own. Sometimes the most powerful response to mockery was simply proving the mockers wrong through quiet competence and unwavering determination. The village blacksmith's son had become a Royal Guard not through luck or chance, but through the same practical wisdom and careful observation that had served him well throughout his life. And in earning that position, he had demonstrated that true nobility came from character and capability rather than birth and social position.